everyone, good morning. الصوت واضح؟
ايه واضح.
طيب, just send the presentation to your leader. And 1 more minute, we're gonna start, inshallah. So. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So let's start our second lecture related to the regulation of pH in human body. So as you remember, in the last session, we have reviewed how pH is regulated by chemical system, which include bicarbonic acid system. Today, inshallah, we're going to see another system that also helps in regulation of the pH, which is the respiratory system. Which is the respiratory system. So, so when the chemical buffer alone cannot prevent change in blood pH, so the respiratory system came in the second line in preventing the large pH change in the body. So how the respiratory system works, it tries to eliminate or retain the CO2. It will also act, so the change for the system are quite rapid. They occur usually within seconds. And also they're going to affect the pressure of CO2. So now I'm going to ask you a question. So when you are running, you are doing, for example, a marathon, or you have been running for like more than 15 minutes. So what happened to your body? So you will feel tired, right? So what do you think is happening in your body when you run fast? Any clue?
Increase the heat.
Yes.
And the exchange of gases.
Why there is an exchange of gases?
So that you are consuming a lot of oxygen, so you breathe a lot in order to.
Yes. So why do you breathe? When you move, which part in the body moves you?
The muscles.
It's the muscles. So what happens in the muscle when you move?
Increase in CO2.
So which provide energy? So
they consume ATP.
Yes, okay, I'm getting there. So you are getting ATP. Yes, go ahead.
Doctor, it's may anaerobic respiration and will made the lactic acid, I think.
Exactly, yes, exactly. So at certain time you have enough oxygen, so you're going to have an aerobic respiration. So, and then after time, you will start producing lactic acid, okay? So what does this lactic acid? It's going to be released in your serum, and it will create some acidification of your serum in the blood. So how your lung reacts to this is by increasing breathing, right? So this is a system that will try to compensate for the decrease in the pH by increasing the breathing. So this is an example that will illustrate what is the respiratory system. We're going to see that in few details. So those are the standard value for the pH will be between 7.35 and 7.45. The pressure of CO2 is going to be between 35 to 45 millimeter mercury. And the concentration of carbonic acid, we have seen that it's 2.4 millimole per liter of plasma, and the bicarbonate, it's about 10 times more. And the pressure of oxygen is between 80 and 110. So any deviation from those values will trigger the starting either the chemical buffering system or the respiratory buffering system or the renal buffering system that we have seen that I'm going to see in a few slides down. So remember this slide, we have seen that in the last presentation, in where we have seen that once how the CO2 is captured from the cellular respiration in the peripheral tissue, and it is captured in the red blood cell and then transported to the lung. So in the plasma, we have a release of the bicarbonate, and we have some also kind of transport of some dissolved CO2. Then when it reaches at the level of the lung, so the bicarbonate is converted, is released, will release the CO2 by the action of carbonic anhydrase, as well as the hemoglobin CO2 also will release the CO2, which will join the venous blood. And it's there where you can see the concentration of dissolved CO2 will affect the blood pCO2 concentration and its proximity to the alveoli in the lung. So that will, in the last, will trigger to the release of the CO2 to the alveoli, and then it's get expelled from the body. So this is how we have seen that how the bicarbonate carbonic acid system transport the CO2 in form of bicarbonate through the hemoglobin. So now for the hemostatic control, or what we call hemostatic control by the respiratory system. So the PO2, the pCO2 concentration can change by the respiratory system. And then if you are changing the partial pCO2, then it will affect on the change of the pH in the arterial plasma within few seconds. So how this happen? How do we know what's the concentration of CO2 in the plasma? So there are actually the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the arterial blood is monitored by a central chemoreceptor in the medulla oblongata. So those will be monitoring the concentration of pCO2. So they are pretty sensitive to the level of carbon dioxide and the pH in the cerebrospinal fluids. Then when there is a change in the pH, the central chemoreceptor send their information to the respiratory center in the medulla oblongata and pons in the brainstem. And then The respiratory center then determine the average rate of ventilation of the alveoli in the lung to keep the partial CO2 in the arterial blood constant. So you can see that is one major step is detection by the chemoreceptor, which will look for, which will examine the concentration of PCO2 and pH in cerebrospinal fluid. And then those chemoreceptors send the information to the respiratory center, which can affect the ventilation rate, okay, of the lung. So let's see here the different possibilities showing the sensitivity of the respiratory center to the change in pH and CO2. So let's see in the table in the PCO2 column, if the PCO2 is high, means the pH is affected, is high, that means you have a high concentration of CO2. So this will lead to a stimulation of the respiratory center, which will lead to a hyperventilation. That will lead to an excess of the CO2 to be removed. If the PCO2 is low, that leads to a low pH, caused by a low pH, for example, this will lead to a repressed respiratory system, that means inhibition of the respiratory system, that will lead to a hypoventilation, and that will lead to CO2 retention. So they have both opposite effect depending if the pH is high or low. So now, how this works? So we said that the alveoli will be activated. So so we can see that the respiratory center will going to regulate the rate of ventilation, and it does so by via the motor neuron, which will activate the muscle of the respiration, particularly the diaphragm. Okay, so the rate of ventilation is controlled by the activation of the muscle of respiration, and diaphragm play an important role in the ventilation or triggering the expiration or inspiration. A rise of the pressure of CO2 in the arterial blood plasma above 5.3 kilopascal, which is related to 40 millimeter of mercury. This by a reflex, it will cause an increased rate of deep breathing through a reflex. So it's going to trigger an automatic increase of rate of deep breathing. So, and then the normal breathing will resume when the concentration of the PCO2 actually come back to its normal value. Similarly, if the partial pressure of carbon dioxide will fall, so instead of increasing, it's going to go down below the normal range. The breathing may be temporarily halted or slowed down to allow the carbon dioxide to accumulate once more in the lung and in the arterial blood. So the system works both ways. So this is when there is a disturbance to the acid-base balance. Suppose here you have an addition of acids, it can be lactic acids coming from muscle effort. So we have seen this slide that the excess of hydronium or hydrogen ion is taken care by the bicarbonate ion to form carbonic acids, will be converted by carbonic anhydrase and then expelled through the CO2 through the lung. Now, this process also is dependent on the kidney, which will provide the bicarbonate reserve, which is the source that will provide the bicarbonate ion. So this slide will gives you what's the situation happens when you have an increase in the pH in the blood. So increase, which is caused by the respiratory, will cause a decrease in the pH, will cause a respiratory acidosis. This is detected by, it will stimulate the arterial of the cerebral, the CSF fluid, chemoreceptor. And those, as we mentioned, the chemoreceptor will trigger the respiratory compensation. And this will increase the respiratory rate. This will decrease the partial pressure of CO2. In the same time, you have the renal compensation. We're going to see that in a few slides down, which will provide the bicarbonate ion and will secrete the excess of hydrogen ion. And the third system is the buffer system that we have seen last time. So all the three systems will contribute to restore the normal acid-basis balance, so to restore the hemostasis. Similarly, inversely, so the three components of the system work with when the hyperventilation is causing the decrease in the PCO2. This will lead to a respiratory alkalosis, also detected by the CSF chemoreceptor. And this will trigger a decrease in the respiratory rates, will increase the partial pressure of CO2. That will lead with the renal compensation and the buffer system to restoring the hemostasis that will lead to a normal acid-base balance. Okay, is there any question for this slide? So is it clear?
Inshallah.
Okay, so it gives you the two situations. The first one, which is caused by hyperventilation that will disturb the hemostasis. And the second one is caused by a hyperventilation that also will disturb the hemostasis. So now let's see what are the different steps that trigger the trigger the changes in the ventilation. So when the alveolar ventilation increase, the concentration of CO2 in the extracellular fluid will decrease. That will also will decrease the H+ concentration, and the reverse also is valid. So when the alveolar ventilation decrease, the CO2 concentration in the ECF will increase, and you're going to get an increase in the concentration of H+. So the pulmonary importance of metabolic formation of CO2. So we know that the concentration of the dissolved CO2 is 1.2 mole per liter is present in the ECF, and this corresponds to the partial pressure of 40 millimeter per mercury. Also, we know that the rate of pulmonary ventilation is inversely proportional to the CO2 and the PCO2. So the CO2 concentration also is related to the partial CO2, which reflects to the soluble fraction of CO2 in serum. So either pulmonary rate of ventilation of CO2 or its formation by tissue can change the partial pressure of CO2 in ESF. So the formation of CO2 in the tissue or the ventilation rates of CO2 can affect its concentration in the ECF. Also, we can say that increasing alveolar ventilation decrease the ECF hydrogen ion concentration and rise the pH. So we've seen that if the alveolar ventilation increase, the PCO2 decrease. If the alveolar ventilation decrease, the PCO2 will increase. So we have seen that if the alveolar ventilation increases by twice the rate, this will increase the pH in the ESF by about 0.023 unit of pH. And if the alveolar ventilation decreases to 1/4 of the normal rate, this will decrease the pH by 0.45. So this will actually reflect to what's happened when there is hypoventilation. We say if it's increased by twice, it will increase the pH. It will decrease the pH by 0.2, and if the hyperventilation will cause the hyperventilation that will cause the decrease of PCO2 will increase the pH by a value of 0.45. So any change in the alveolar ventilation rate, it's much greater in reducing the level of pH than increasing the level of pH. So the respiratory system is more efficient in treating the decrease pH for acidic pH than for alkaline pH. So why is that? Because the alveolar ventilation rate decrease, it will cause an increase in the pH, then oxygen is added in the blood that will reduces the need for an additional hydrogen ion. So the demand of the oxygen in the blood increases. That will lead in the partial pressure of oxygen also will decrease, and that will stimulate the ventilation, which is also caused because an increase in the pH will reduce the partial pressure of oxygen. That will increase the ventilation rate to restore it back. Also, when the concentration of hydrogen ion fall below the normal, the respiration is depressed, the alveolar ventilation decrease, so the hydrogen ion concentration go back into the normal pressure. So those slides are just repeating again what we have seen in the in the slide that shows everything. So what happens when you have lung function impairment? That means if you have, for example, an obstruction in the lung or a disease that will lead, that can be caused by emphysema or a respiratory disorder. In this case, the kidney will play, if the lung are affected, so the kidney will play a major role in compensation for returning the pH to normal. So now let's see what happened in the kidney for the regulation of the renal of the acid-base control. So the kidney are the third line of defense against the white change in the body fluid. So how it does this? It does by moving the bicarbonate into serum. Also, it will act by either retention or excretion of acids, and also by generating additional buffer. The kidney is usually is a long-term mechanism. So difference between the chemical buffer regulation or the respiratory system regulation, the kidney or the renal acid-based regulation system may take hours to days for correction. So how it does that? So the kidney will control the pH by adjusting the amount of bicarbonate ion that is excreted or reabsorbed. Also, we can see that the reabsorption of bicarbonate is equivalent to a secretion of a free hydrogen ion. I'm going to see that in a few moments. Also, a change in the renal bases, in the renal acid base handling occur usually hour to day after the changes in the acid base status. So we have seen this slide in the previous lecture, in where you can see on the right side the role of the kidney in providing the bicarbonate reserve, and thus affecting the by importing or releasing the bicarbonate ion, it can affect the pH. So the role of the kidney is the preservation of the body bicarbonate store by, and this is accomplished by reabsorption of about 99.9% of filtered bicarbonate in serum. Also, it will lead for the generation or the regeneration of titrated bicarbonate by the excretion of titrable acidity or ammonium sulfate or ammonium salt. Also, all the bicarbonate ion in the serum are filtered as it passes through the glomerular. So this filtration process leads to its high level of reabsorption. So this is a section of in the kidney where you can see the proximal convoluted tubule cell on the center, and you have the lumen of the proximal tubule that will lead to the urine that will be excreted. So you can see here in the bicarbonate ion is absorbed, and then it is combined. It's actually the CO2 is captured, combined with water. It's converted to carbonic acid by carbonic anhydrase, which is converted into bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ion. So this hydrogen ion is going to be released back to the lumen of the proximal tubule, and the bicarbonate ion is released to the bloodstream. So when this bicarbonate ion is regenerated, is released, so there is an hydrogen ion is captured from the bloodstream. So this mechanism occurs when the pH is low, because it's removing the hydrogen ion from the bloodstream and moving it to the lumen of the proximal tubule on the left side into the urine. So how the renal acid-base mechanism work? So similarly, there are some sensors, as we have seen in the respiratory system, there are sensors which will be affected by the plasma bicarbonate ion concentration. Those are in the renal tubule cells of the distal convoluted tubules. So those are sensitive to the pH of the plasma. So what happens with the renal metabolism in the tubular cells? They will produce CO2, which is rapidly converted into H plus and bicarbonate ion through the action of carbonic anhydrase. So when the extracellular fluid tends to go to be acids, so if the ECF is acidic, so what's going to happen here is the renal tubular cells will secrete the H plus ion into the tubular fluid from where they exit the body via the urine. Okay, so this is what we are seeing here on the left side, where you can see in the lumen of the proximal tubes, you have the H plus is going to be released in the urine. And the other side is the bicarbonate ion are simultaneously secreted into the blood plasma. We can see here in the right side. And then this will raise the bicarbonate ion concentration in the plasma. And this will lower the carbonic acid bicarbonate ion ratio. And this will lead to increasing the pH in the plasma. So basically, this is the mechanism that regulates when there is an increase in the pH. So when the pH of the plasma rises above normal, so what's going to happen? The bicarbonate ion are excreted in the urine, and the hydrogen ion are secreted into the plasma to decrease the pH. So this will lead to, the hydrogen ion will combine with the bicarbonate ion in the plasma to form carbonic acids. And then this will raise the carbonic acid bicarbonate ratio in the extracellular fluid, and then will return the pH to normal value. So usually in this case, the urine produced is generally acids and is partially neutralized by the ammonia that is excreted in the urine when the glutamate and glutamine are deaminated in the distal tubular epithelial cells. So in this case, the urine will going to be acids. So when the plasma is alkaline, so the urine will going to turn acids, and this will be neutralized by ammonium ion. And some of the acid content of the urine also reside actually in the production of NH plus 4, that is the NH3 plus H will give you NH4 plus that will capture which will actually remove some acidity from the urine. However, this nitrogen concentration doesn't affect the pH in the plasma, or doesn't affect the pH hemostasis in the extracellular fluid. So those are the steps that we just mentioned, from step 1 to step 6, where in step 1, you can see the CO2, that is when there is an elevated pressure of CO2, it's going to be captured by the proximal convoluted tubule cells. And this will combine with a water molecule and converted by carbonic anhydrase to carbonic acids. And this will quickly split, forming hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ions. The hydrogen ion will be secreted into the filtrate and the tubal lumen, and will be actually exported, released in the urine. And then for each hydrogen that is secreted, you have a sodium which is imported. Then you have the secreted H+ will combine with the bicarbonate ion in the filtrate. It could form the carbonic acids. And at the same time, you have the bicarbonate acids. The bicarbonate will disappear from the filtrate at the same rate of that of the bicarbonate which is formed within the cells. So the rate of formation of bicarbonate in the cells is compensated by the release of the bicarbonate in the urine. And finally, in step number 5, you can see that the formed carbonic acid, which is formed in the filtrate, will dissociate into CO2 and H2O. And this CO2 will diffuse into the tubules, where it's trigger further H+ secretion. And you can see the loop is closed in terms of regulation of the amount of hydrogen ion which is captured to regulate the pH, and the release of the bicarbonate ion in the plasma to compensate for the rise in the pH. So what are the factors that are affecting the bicarbonate reabsorption in the proximal renal tubular cells? So there are 4 factors that affect this. The first one is the pressure of CO2. Second one is the concentration of potassium in the intracellular fluid. Third one is the concentration of chlorine ion. And the fourth is the concentration of the adrenocorticoid hormones. So let's see the first factor, which is the partial pressure of CO2. So when the partial pressure of CO2 increases, this will lead to an increase in the bicarbonate acids. This will lead to an increase of secretion of hydrogen ion. That will lead to an increased reabsorption by the kidney of the bicarbonate ion. This bicarbonate ion will be excreted, lead to its excretion to the urine. That will lead to an acidic urine. Inversely, when the pressure of CO2 is decreased, this will decrease the level of acidic carbonic acids, will decrease the secretion of the hydrogen ion, and this will lead to a decrease in the bicarbonate ion reabsorption, and this will lead to bicarbonate ion excretion in the urine that will lead to an alkaline urine. Factor affecting, or the second type of factor that will affect the bicarbonate reabsorption by the kidney is the concentration of potassium in the ICF. So how it works? So when the potassium concentration increases, so this will lead to an increased excretion of bicarbonate ion and will lead to a decreased reabsorption of bicarbonic ion. That will lead to a decrease of secretion of bicarbonic ion, and that will lead to an alkaline urine. Second possibility is then now you have a decrease of potassium in the ICF, will lead to an acidic urine because of the decrease in the excretion of the bicarbonate and an increase of reabsorption of the bicarbonate, and that will lead an increase of the secretion of the bicarbonate ion, all will lead to urine, an acidic urine. Second factor also that may also affect if you are administering the potassium, administration of the potassium is high. So the potassium will enter the cells, the tubular cells, and the hydrogen ion will leave at the same time the cells. So just and those hydrogen ion will be buffered by the bicarbonate ion. That will lead to decrease of concentration of bicarbonate ion because it is converted into bicarbonate acids. So its concentration will decrease. This will lead to decreased secretion of the hydrogen ion across the tubular epithelial cells. That will lead to a decrease of bicarbonate ion reabsorption and lead to the bicarbonate ion increase excretion that will lead to an alkaline urine. Similarly, the process here explaining that if there is potassium deficiency, that will lead to urine acidics, or it's called also paradoxic aciduria. We're going to see that in the next lecture. So to sum everything in the action of the potassium concentration in the ECF fluid. So the potassium concentration, when it increases, it leads to an acidic ECF that will lead to an alkaline urine. And a decrease of potassium concentration will lead to an alkaline UCF that will lead to an acidic urine. So you can see always the urine status is opposite to the ICF pH stage. So if it's alkaline, the urine is going to be acids. If it's acids, the urine is going to be alkaline. So the third factor that will affect the bicarbonate reabsorption is the plasma level of chlorine. So when the chlorine concentration increase, that will affect the reabsorption of bicarbonate ion. That will lead to an increased excretion of the bicarbonate ion. If the plasma level of chlorine decrease, that will lead to the reverse, will lead to an increased reabsorption of bicarbonate ion and a decrease in excretion of the bicarbonate ion. The fourth factor that affects the concentration of bicarbonate is the concentration of adrenal corticoid hormones. So we have seen with Cushing syndrome, which is disease in which the corticoid hormone are affected. Those will lead to potassium deficiency that will lead, as we have seen earlier, the decreased reabsorption of bicarbonate ion. So those we have seen the four factors that affect the bicarbonate reabsorption, either in the ICF or in the ECF. Now, let's move to another concept, which is also important in the pH regulation. So the anion gap is the anion reflect to the anion and cation concentration in the extracellular fluid. So usually in the extracellular fluid, we have the sum of the anion and cation is always equal to sodium and potassium that will account usually for about 95% of the cation. We have the chlorine and bicarbonate. They will account usually for 68% of the anion. So you can see for the anion, there is less accountability than the cation. Cation is 95%, but the anion is only 68%, which are presented by chlorine and bicarbonate. So there is a difference between measured anion and cation. Okay, so this unmeasured anion, which is the difference between 68% and 100%, is constitute what we call an anion gap. So usually this anion gap is not ion, but they are what we call unmeasured ion, which are protein anion, sulfate, phosphate, and organic acids. They all contribute to those unmeasured anion. So you can see on the left side, the cation are mostly accounted for, more than 95% are accounted. But for the anion, you can see it's only the chlorine and the bicarbonate ion are accounted, but you have the miscellaneous ion, which contribute to the gap, which is formed by those different component or the different compound, as we mentioned, protein and acids. So the anion gap can be then calculated by measuring the concentration of the potassium plus sodium minus the concentration of bicarbonate ion plus chlorine anion. So why it is important? So we use the anion gap. It's a way of determining the cause of metabolic acidosis. So the idea is that you should always have a balance between the anion and cation. So and it is determined by this operation. You can see the cation, the number of cation minus the number of anion. So a normal anion gap is usually between 8 to 12 milli equivalent per liter. This is because there is naturally a little bit more cation than anion. However, if the amount of organic anion, for example, lactate, increase, so they will take up more of the anion. This means that less of the anion will be Cl minus and HCO3 minus, so the gap will increase. So when the pH increases, so most of the H3CO3, as they will go and compensate for this increase in the in the decrease of the pH, and that will lead to an increase in the gap. So you can see in the normal acid-base status, you always have a gap, which is due to the unmeasured anion. And during a normal acidosis, so you can see the level of HCCO3 will decrease because, for example, for the HCCO3 minus, the bicarbonate will try to compensate for a rise in the pH, a decrease in the pH, for example, when you got lactic acids release. But the anion gap is still not affected in this situation. So in the elevated gap, this is when you have metabolic acidosis, and where here it's the chlorine now, which is the chlorine, which is level which is affected. Okay, so how it goes from the normal, then you have the normal gap, metabolic acidosis. And then if the situation, if there is even more acids coming up, so it will move to the third level, which is the elevated gap metabolic acidosis, in which in this case, it's the level of the chlorine anion which is affected. So the anion gap in the metabolic acidosis will lead to the accumulation of acids and a loss of bicarbonate ion, so as we have seen. So you have the metabolic acidosis due to an acid accumulation, and you have a metabolic acidosis due to the HCO loss, the bicarbonate acids, the bicarbonate loss. So we can define the metabolic acidosis is when the pH of the blood is less than 7.35, and this is caused by an increase in H+ ion or lactate or organic acids, or by the loss of the bicarbonate ion. So you can see both those situations will lead to the defect in the anion gap. So let's see here an example how the anion gap is calculated. For example, we have the concentration of sodium is 136 plus the concentration of potassium. Those are the normal level, it's 4. This will equal 100, which is the chlorine concentration, plus 25, which is the concentration of bicarbonic acids. So we need to determine what is the A-, which is the unaccounted for anion. So determine the unaccounted for anion, which is the gap. So it is actually subtraction from the total of cation minus the total of anion. And this will give you a value which is 15 milliequivalent, which is, this is about the normal value of the anion gap. So in normal situation, the anion gap will be between 12 plus or minus 4. Other thing, if the anion gap is calculated using the potassium concentration, because there are two ways to determine it, either just using the potassium or using also the calcium, the potassium and the sodium. So that the normal value is going to be 16 plus minus 4. So what is the significance of the anion gap? So why it is calculated? So it is used to help to diagnose the condition of acid-base balance and imbalance. So we have seen that a high anion gap acidosis will lead to renal failure or diabetes mellitus. And we can see that normal anion gap, which is the lower severity, which will lead to diarrhea or hypercholeremic acidosis. So that's why it is important to include the anion gap as a diagnostic tools for trying to do what we call a differential diagnosis for those different conditions. Okay, so I think that's a complete today review of our lecture for the acid-bases balance. So we have seen how the respiratory system affect the level can control the pH through increase or decrease of ventilation rates. Also, we have seen how the kidney also affect the pH by acting on reabsorption or excretion of the bicarbonate ion. And we have seen what are the factors that can affect this reabsorption of the bicarbonate ion. And finally, we have seen what are those anion gap and why the anion gap is important. Its calculation is important to diagnose acid balance disturbances. Okay, so to now, is there any questions? Or it's clear?
Yeah, it's clear.
Okay, so thank you. So if there is anything, any questions, so welcome my office hour and also through communication through my email. Okay, thank you guys. Take care. See you inshallah after the recess week. Inshallah, good weekend. Salam alaikum.